Good evening and welcome to the news today. Hundreds of migrants have been dying in the Mediterranean Sea trying to reach Europe for months. But it was the discovery of 71 bodies in a truck on an Austrian highway on Thursday that has multiplied calls for Europe to finally devise a policy to cope with crisis. Ayman Siksik has more.
Concrete measures. That's what Germany, France and Britain are calling for Sunday, issuing a joint call for an urgent meeting of European Union ministers to cope with the escalating migration crisis. Unprecedented numbers of migrants are reaching EU borders, surpassing 100,000 in July alone and reaching more than 340,000 this year so far. And Europe is struggling to find a policy to cope with calls for tighter uniform rules. Hungary, facing an influx of migrants on the Serbia border, has begun fingerprinting those entering its territory.
The refugees are afraid of the Hungarian fingerprint regime because they are well aware of the fact that if their fingerprint is recorded in Hungary, then legally there is the opportunity for any Western European country to send them back to Hungary.
The Netherlands, for its part, is set to toughen its asylum policy by cutting off food and shelter for people who fail to qualify as refugees, raising the key question of who would be able to qualify and at what cost. Alongside discussions, the reality is jarring. On the coasts of Italy, bodies continued to wash up Sunday, another migrant journey across the Mediterranean ending in disaster.
They discovered yesterday 2 dead bodies drifting in the sea. With no connection to a SAR event, we don't know what has happened to the dead bodies. But of course, we're taking them on board and storing them in our cooling container, and then we will start the identification work.
Italy and Greece are 2 of the countries in which the 28-nation EU bloc has called for reception centers to be set up urgently to register new arrivals. On Saturday, the European Union held a rescue drill off the Libyan coast in preparation for dealing with further sunken vessels.
I have a daughter back home. She's 6 months old. And at one time, I had to pick up 2 infants, approximately the same age as her.
These rescue teams have their work cut out for them. As for those fleeing war-torn Libya and Syria, there is nothing left to lose.
We understand death is here. We are prepared to die. This is a journey of death, and we know we don't even have a 1% guarantee of making it.
For Ahmed and many others like him, the final destination is a passport-free area of Serbia's northern border with Hungary. And for those fleeing far worse in their countries of origin to come to open EU countries, one question is still going unanswered. What will Europe choose to do with them next?
And with me right now in the studio is Dr. Esther Lupate, Director, Center for European Studies. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining me. You know, I'm looking at the situation, and it's so difficult. I just came back from Greece, and I saw on the streets hundreds, thousands of migrants all over. And from one side, you're saying your heart just goes out, and from the other side, being in Greece and knowing the difficult economic situation that Greece is facing, you're saying, how can they, from where can they even start helping this amount of migrants, and how can you even cope with that?
It's an excellent question. I mean, eventually, it's a real dilemma. You know, you have a human tragedy here. People who fleeing from persecution, from poverty, in the case of many African refugees, but in the case of Syrian refugees, I mean, they're fleeing from persecution. They want to defend their families, so it's a real tragedy. And they want to be protected, you know, by those who consider to be the role model for human rights, the Europeans. On the other hand, when they come to Greece, I mean, Greece is actually facing a financial crisis. If you look at the unemployment rate among the youngest people in Greece, we're talking about more than 50% are unemployed. So that's, you know, how can they possibly offer a job, you know, when they are actually struggling, you know, and have difficulties, you know, to survive. I mean, so it's a question of really of survival in Greece. It's a question, so it's really hard to be generous, you know, before you're taking care of your own people. So it's a real tragedy, you know, and that's why most of refugees, if you ask them, they don't want to stay in Greece. For them,
it's
you know,
like another stop to get to Europe.
Yeah.
And I just want to join to this conversation. With me from London is Gary Van Gulik, Deputy European Director at Amnesty International. Good evening. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So, you know, we are talking about, for example, in Greece, that this is not a stop to actually get in Europe. But we're seeing what is happening right now in Europe with the right wing, and maybe even racism and maybe even nationalism is getting more and more extreme. How can they even start thinking in a social way to accept foreigners?
Well, this is about something even more fundamental. I mean, we're not talking about accepting foreigners, we're about giving protection to those who are actually entitled to it. Now, that might seem like a vague, sort of naive international law kind of argument, but we're talking about a global refugee crisis of over 19 million refugees worldwide. Europe right now is taking an incredibly small share of that. So, you know, whether popular or not, whether difficult or not, in the end, one of the solutions has to entail letting more people in, whether politically tricky or not. But there's other things that can be done to mitigate, to make sure that those who do enter Europe are treated in a different way and also are integrated in a different way, are helped in a different way that establishes a situation where you have a lower rate of hate crimes, for example, and less of a sense of those foreigners coming to take our jobs.
You know, Gary, if I'm taking what you're saying, and we're talking about integration, for example, and let's take France and what happened after Charlie Hebdo, and the people spoke and analyzed the situation, that basically maybe the Muslim or the Arab or the foreigners community was not able to actually integrate in the French society. You know, we're talking about millions and millions of people. We're talking about a different era. We're talking about a different generation. Why, and how should a country actually start coping with this? What, they should give like citizenship to millions and millions of people and say, okay, you're welcome, and then what?
Well, at the moment, we're nowhere near talking about millions of people being led into Europe. And we're talking about tens of thousands at the moment in terms of refugees, right? So what we're talking about is giving the basic protection to those who are fleeing persecution and war. So when you're talking about the foreigner population, I assume that you are talking about quite a large, diverse group of people. What we're now discussing is this new group, especially Syrians, I have to say, that really is making up the largest proportion of this group of refugees at the moment, and how they can get to safety. I mean, that's really a very basic consideration. Now, some countries are able to. If you look at, in some ways, for example, Germany, who's taking on more than Europe in total, it's able to slowly but surely build enough centers, at least for asylum seekers, make sure that hate crimes are rejected, are prosecuted, etc., and are able to give basic protection to those who are entitled to it.
Yes.
So it's not impossible. It's hard, but it's not impossible.
Gary van Gulik, thank you very, very much for joining me in this conversation. You want to tell me, Dr. Lopatin, that no one actually saw it coming?
I think, you know, they prefer not to see it, because I think what happened, like immediately after the Arab Spring, only thousands of refugees came from the Middle East. Most of them came from Tunisia, and they, like, originally they wanted to go to France, so they came to Italy on the way to France. So we're talking about only, you know, a few thousands, not a lot, not a big number. So many people actually hope that, you know, maybe it will be possible actually not to admit so many people from the Arab Spring, because, you know, as we've seen with the Tunisians, we didn't get so many of them. But on the other hand, I think what happened in Syria, no one actually anticipated this is what's going to happen in Syria. Somehow, like, they thought it's going to be differently, you know, like Assad is going to be removed, like, you know, Gaddafi, like, or other leaders in the Middle East. So it's going to be a very smooth process. It's not going to take so many years, you know. Assad is still there, and he's likely to stay there for, I don't know, for how many months. But no one anticipated. They thought it's going to be really quick. But second thing, there is another thing that we should take into consideration that I think Europe probably they could have anticipated, because what happened is that, you know, one reason why there was a dramatic decrease in the number of refugees from 2004 until 2013 in Europe, for almost a decade, it was because of Gaddafi's willingness to work with the Europeans. Since 2004, he got a lot of money, and I'm talking really about a lot of money from the EU in order to stop migrants, especially from Africa, from actually entering into Europe through Libya. And in 2010, just to give an example, there was an agreement between the European Union and Gaddafi in October 2010, and he was supposed to get 50 million euro to stop migrants to come to the Middle East. But he died, you know, a year later in October 2011. And now European Union doesn't have a partner in the region.
We're happy about the Arab Spring, but nobody actually realized what the circumstances and what the results will be afterwards. Dr. Lopatin, thank you very, very much for this. Thank you.